When it comes to the deadliest fighter aces of history, those Luftwaffe boys are always top of the list. Booby Hartmann alone shot down 5.6 times the top scoring Allied ace, Ivan Kozydub. The Germans' score was also about 8.6 times more aircraft than bagged by the likes of Patel or Boeing. He wasn't alone. According to some sources, the Luftwaffe claimed just shy of 68,000 Allied aircraft destroyed, from the Vistula to the Volga, over the deserts of Tunisia to the cold skies of the fjord at Tonsberg, to the fields of Kent to... Okay, you get the idea. These guys shot down a heck of a lot of planes. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself, which was the plane most likely to be shot down by the boys with black crosses on their wings? Well, I've spent hours going through the figures and nearly gone blind sorting out the data in my spreadsheets. All this to bring you the top 20 most destroyed Allied planes to fall under the guns of the Luftwaffe. I've also sat down and worked out the types of Allied aircraft the top 20 Luftwaffe aces downed. I've included those percentages as well for you stat lovers. So get your bets in now. Which aircraft will you find on today's list? Let's get started with number 20. Okay, so number 20 on my list is actually number 21. Even before we've gotten started, I have to admit I fudged the numbers a bit. Why? Well, according to the long list of claims put in by the Luftwaffe chaps, the 20th most shot down aircraft at a whopping 1,137 was this one. No, it wasn't some cool experimental crate put up by the Allies, it's just shorthand for Vier motoriges Flugzeug, in my best German accent, literally 4-engine aircraft. Now, as all these claims were put in by night fighter units, I took the liberty of adding these figures into the Lancaster, Halifax and Stirling columns. I even did some fancy maths to figure out the relative numbers that each of the 4-engine bombers represented to the RAF fleet, and therefore the likelihood that they were the unidentified aircraft shot down by some night fighter ace in the dead of night. So at this point in the video, I'm going to put it out there and say take these numbers with a big pinch of salt. They are Luftwaffe claims. So number 20 on the list is... When the Wehrmacht pulled into the Soviet Union early on the 22nd of June 1941, MiG-3s were waiting for them in neat little lines on Russian airfields. Despite being a work in progress, the MiG-3 turned out to be a capable fighter and quite deadly in the hands of a skilled Soviet pilot. Nevertheless, in the aerial combats that followed Operation Barbarossa, around 1,124 MiG-3s were claimed as destroyed by the Luftwaffe. That being said, the Russian fighter was used by no fewer than 59 Soviet pilots to reach acehood. The top MiG-3 ace has to be Senior Lieutenant A. Dmitriev of the 15th IAP, who shot down 15 enemy aircraft and shared in the destruction of 2 others before being killed on the 13th of November 1941. In total, the Luftwaffe claimed to have destroyed 33% of the MiG-3 fleet, and this aircraft accounts for just over 2% of all aircraft claims by the Germans. By the time the famed P-51 started reaching European skies in real numbers, the Luftwaffe was already waning, but was not beaten yet. Operated by both the British and her Commonwealth and the Americans, the Luftwaffe shot the Mustang down regardless of how the pilot spelt the word honour. While the P-51 would eventually shoot down just shy of 5,000 Axis aircraft in the hands of its skilled pilots, an impressive 1,191 were claimed by German pilots. Most of these Mustangs were lost under the banner of the 8th Air Force, but the first was likely one from 239 Squadron RAF. On the 21st of July 1942, Hauptmann Hermann Felix Boltz jumped a pair of Mustangs over Normandy with 5 other FW-190s. He hit and forced Flight Lieutenant Ville to crash land his aircraft. However, he initially put in a claim for a P-40. The next month, over the Dieppe, he put in another 2 claims on the 19th of August, this time definitely claiming 2 Mustangs. Dieppe would also incidentally be the location of the first ever Mustang victory. An unlucky FW-190 fell under the guns of American flight officer Hollis "Holly" Hills, who was flying with the Canadians in 414 Squadron. The Germans hardly put a dent in the 13,300 P-51s produced, only claiming to have destroyed 9% of them. The Mustang only accounts for 0.93% of all those aircraft claimed by the top deadliest German aces. Before we get into today's story, I just want to quickly tell you about something pretty amazing. I'm sure that, like me, you've always found the stories of the air crew during World War II absolutely thrilling, and I'm sure you've also thought the following: Man, those flying jackets look pretty cool. Now, with the great deals from legendary USA, you can get your hands on an authentic B3 or RAF style bomber jacket. Real sheepskin, real warm, and a real fashion statement. But wait, are you more of a fighter jock? Don't worry, I've got you covered too. Why not get your hands on a genuine leather A2 flight jacket? Just add some shades and you'll feel like a real flying tiger. There's a whole range of jackets for men and women, and at really affordable prices. All jackets are made in the USA and are shipped all around the globe. I've got mine in the post already. If you want to know more about the absolutely fantastic deals available with my link that even your better half can't argue with, then check out the details above or in the description below. Now, let's get back to the story. The P-38 Lightning was the first true long-range fighter to reach the European theatre. It had the ability to escort American bombers much further than the RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes, and had much harder-hitting firepower. But this doesn't mean it was invulnerable to the Germans it met over Europe and North Africa. The Luftwaffe claimed at least 1,220 Lightnings during the course of the war. This is about 12% of the 10,037 P-38s produced. The first was claimed by Hans Joachim Stroller of JG-26 on the 2nd of October 1942 over Cap Gris-Nez. However, the Lightning would only account for 0.75% of the aircraft claimed by the top 20 Experten, and just 1.8% of all Luftwaffe claims. But in its battle with the Luftwaffe, it was the P-38 that would draw first blood. On the 14th of August 1942, two P-38s flown by Major John W. Weltman and Second Lieutenant Elza E. Shahan, then on Iceland for a fuel stop, attacked a FW-200 C-4 Condor and shot it down. We won't mention that a P-40 flown by Lieutenant Schaffer had already damaged one of its engines. The P-47 was a beast of an aircraft. It was considerably bigger than the Bf-109 and double its weight, even when empty. Even so, it would take a while for the American and Luftwaffe pilots to appreciate the Thunderbolt's effectiveness as a fighter. While stories like the one about Robert S. Johnson, who was attacked by Ace Egon Meyer on June 26, 1943, can attest to the P-47's ruggedness, it was by no means invincible. Johnson may have miraculously survived his encounter with the Luftwaffe that day, but at least 1,310 P-47s were claimed by the Germans during the war. Even so, that was just a small fraction of the 15,686 built, a mere 8%. In addition, the top 20 German aces also only attributed the P-47 as victim in their claims 0.8% of the time. With improved tactics and developments to the aircraft, the P-47 became a respected adversary and much loved by its pilots, so perhaps it would be better to be sitting in the cockpit of the P-47 than any other American fighter during World War II. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. The I-16 is the embodiment of the old adage, you fight with what you got. Facing the Luftwaffe in the summer of 1941, the aircraft was already obsolete. By 1943, it was even more so. When the I-16 fought over Spain and against the Japanese in China, it was able to hold its own. Political strife in the Soviet Union since 1937 meant that the VVS pilot had to face the Germans flying a Rata, many of whom were not skilled enough to get the most out of the aircraft. The I-16 actually had a lot of good features, including a good climb and roll rate, but was no match for the Bf-109 in terms of speed or flight stability. You might be surprised to learn that the Luftwaffe only claimed approximately 1,413 I-16s during World War II, which is about 14% of the total 10,292 made. Many more were of course destroyed on the ground during the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa, but even more were lost during accidents. This was not an aircraft for the amateur. Still, the I-16 accounts for just over 2% of all German claims and 3.11% of all by the top 20 aces. Number 35 Squadron of Bomber Command was the first unit to receive the new 4-engine Halifax bomber on the 13th of November 1940. It was said to be far superior to the Avro Lancaster and Short Stirling, which had just beaten it into service. The aircraft also proved to be very versatile and was used both as a bomber and in coastal command roles. Number 35 Squadron joined Number 4 Bomb Group and mounted the first Halifax operation on the night of the 11th and 12th of March, an attack on Le Havre. Things didn't go well, and only 4 out of the 7 bombers actually reached the target. That night, the Halifax was also to experience its first loss, but not to the Luftwaffe. On returning to Britain, 135 Squadron Halifax was shot down by a not-so-friendly fighter, killing all but the pilot and flight engineer. The Luftwaffe would have to wait to make its first claim. According to the records I have, the first Halifax shot down by a German was claimed on the 13th of June 1941 by Oberleutnant Paul Semrau from NJG2. But John Lake in his book puts the first Halifax downed a week later on the 20th. What is also unclear is exactly how many of the bombers were downed by the Luftwaffe. There are 1,249 definite claims identifying a Halifax as the victim. Interestingly, no Halifaxes were claimed by the top 20 German aces. Of the 1,137 vier motoriges Flugzeug, and there's that perfect German accent again, I've assigned about 441 additional Halifaxes shot down. There are also several claims that are just listed as shot down during the war, and others that are unidentified. So again, take these numbers with a pinch of salt, and let's just move on to the next victim. The P-39 is one of the most unusually designed fighters of World War II. The location of its engine must have perplexed many of the engine fitter, but its tricycle landing gear must have been a dream to the inexperienced pilot. It was also one of the very few American-designed aircraft to boast a cannon. Saying all this, it was not really appreciated by the nation that bore it, nor by its English-speaking allies. When you talk about P-39 losses in Europe, you are really talking about aircraft operated by the Soviet Union. The Brits did try out 80 in 1941, but the pilots of 601 Squadron didn't think they were suitable for European operations. They basically just palmed them off on the Russians. On the Eastern Front, the P-39 would become one of the most successful Lend-Lease fighters and was ideally suited to the low-altitude tactics used by the Soviets. The Luftwaffe would claim 1,740 P-39s destroyed in combat, about 18% of the total ever made. It is by far the most shot-down American fighter on this list by the top 20 aces, accounting for 6.73% of their total claims. But of course the Russians hit back hard too. The top scoring P-39 ace of the Russian front has to be Vasily Bondarenko, who downed 19 enemy aircraft out of a total 24 in a P-39. The Luftwaffe would meet the mighty Hurricane for the first time over Metz in December 1939, where Oberleutnant Hans von Hahn and Hauptmann Werner Molders each claimed one. However, of course, this was not the first Hurricane shot down in the Second World War. 2 Hurricanes from 151 Squadron were shot down by Spitfires of 74 Squadron, who had identified them as Bf-109s. This was on the 6th of September 1939, when the nearest Luftwaffe fighter bases were well beyond the 109's range. The entire incident was barking indeed, and left 1 pilot dead, 1 group captain initially sacked, and 2 Spitfire pilots court-martialed. More on this in an upcoming video. When the Luftwaffe did actually tangle with the Hurricane, it claimed 1,750, which was about 12% of the 14,483 built. However, I would guess that a few more Hurricanes fell to the Germans, especially over England in 1940, and may have been put down as Spitfires. It's just a hunch. When the Yak-1 was tested by the Soviet Air Force against the I-16, it was found to be superior in every aspect, especially speed. One of the most compelling features for the VVS pilots was that it was so easy to fly, almost like a trainer, one test pilot commented. However, it was not as advanced in terms of construction as the Bf-109 or later FW-190. The Yak-1's wings were largely made out of wood, and much of the aircraft's skin was also wooden. It didn't possess key equipment such as radios, and even production models experienced dangerous faults such as unreliable undercarriage retraction systems. Nevertheless, the Yak would become one of the most common fighters from 1942 and was developed further by the Soviets. Earlier versions were without question inferior to the Bf-109F it faced, and was poorly made in comparison. However, it was cheap to produce and thousands could be made to be flown by thousands of inexperienced VVS pilots leaving training schools. Its easier handling qualities made this possible. Despite being produced in very high numbers, 37,000, German pilots only claim to have shot down 1,940 Yak-1s during the war. This might suggest that improvements to the later version Yak-1B had a positive effect on the survivability of its pilots. It might also suggest that the Russians crashed more Yaks than Germans could shoot down. The Curtiss P-40, in all its variants, was one of the most widely used early war fighter and saw action in every theatre of operations and with almost all of the Allied nations during World War II. The Germans faced it almost everywhere they went. Perhaps not the powerhouse the Bf-109 was at high altitudes or as aerobatic as the FW-190, the P-40 had devastating armament and an impressive turn rate that made it a deadly adversary. First used against the Germans by the British in the form of the Tomahawks and Kitty Hawks, they would also be sent to Russia under Lend-Lease. The Americans also used the P-40 against the Germans, with the 57th Fighter Group fighting it out in North Africa and through into Italy, equipped with Warhawks well into 1944. The Germans claimed 1,961 P-40s downed on various fronts, which is about 14% of all produced. Interestingly, the great ace, Erich Hartmann, didn't seem to have met any P-40s during his long career. Hans-Joachim Marseille claimed 82, an astounding 51% of all aircraft he claimed to have destroyed. For number 10 on the list, I have to make another little confession. I've essentially lumped the claims of the DB3 and the IL-4 together, as they are really variants of the same aircraft. I'm also convinced from the data that the Germans didn't really differentiate between the two types. The DB3 was in production from 1936 to 1939, when some 1,500 were built, while the IL-4, with its better engines and defensive armament, was built from 1942 to the end of the war. The Soviets pushed out just over 5,000 examples in that time. While looking over the claims, it seemed to me that DB3s were being shot down well beyond the time that few would have been left in the frontline units. So I took the unelected decision to count all these claims together. We are talking about Soviet aircraft and my power over this script is absolute. That being said, the Germans claimed to have downed a total of 2,055 DB3s or IL-4s. That's about 3% of all Soviet aircraft shot down, but only represents about 1% of the top expertins tally. Given the fact that DB stands for Long Range Bomber in Russian, it's no surprise that it was this aircraft which was the very first Soviet bomber to bomb Berlin. DB3Ts flying from Saaremaa, an island on the Baltic to the west of Estonia, attacked the German capital on the 8th of August 1941. This was just 1 year shy of the first RAF raid on the capital the previous year, and over a year since the French Farman F222 attacked on the 7th of June 1940. The Petlyakov Pe-2 was the Soviet Union's answer to a lack of dive bombers in its air force in the late 1930s. In this role, the P-2 performed extremely well, especially when the German forces were slowly pushed back. It possessed good flying characteristics, was fairly fast, as well as being liked by its pilots. All this being said, it has an origin story out of some tragic Russian novel. During the Great Purge of the 1930s, the lead designer, Vladimir Petlyakov, was imprisoned by the NKVD in a Sirashka. This was effectively a gulag masquerading as a research facility, where engineers, too useful to be shot, were kept under close supervision. The success of the P-2 effectively gave Petlyakov his freedom, and he was allowed to have his name associated with the aircraft. Though almost perfect in every other respect, it did have one significant flaw. Due to the nature of its wing design, which was optimized for high-altitude flight, the aircraft was less maneuverable at slow speeds. This meant that the pilot literally had to pull the twin-engine bomber off the runway, which required real strength. Once you had gotten over this alarming reality, the aircraft was apparently very docile when in the air. The Pe-2 was one of the most produced twin-engine aircraft of the war, with 11,400 being produced. Of these, the Germans claimed 2,061. The Pe-2 accounts for 3% of all German claims and about the same proportion for the top 20 Experten. The Yak-9 was to become one of the most versatile and beloved Soviet fighters of World War II. It was fast, highly manoeuvrable at low altitude, and was a match for any German fighter in the right hands. Starting life as an offshoot of the successful Yak-7, of which 592 the Germans claimed to have shot down, the Yak-9 was to evolve into something more remarkable. Initially designed as a wood-metal airframe, improvements in material and production techniques allowed Yakovlev to produce a much lighter airframe. The secret was duralumin, a lightweight aluminium used to skin the aircraft, paired with an excellent series of Klimov engines. The much lighter aircraft allowed it to be modified both in terms of armament and to achieve longer range. In total, 15 main variants of the Yak-9 were produced. Most notable is the Yak-9T, the famed tank buster. While perhaps not always able to knock out German tanks, the heavy 37mm cannon mounted in these Yak-9s could do immense damage. Some have compared the Yak-9 to the P-51 and Spitfire, even saying it was a better aircraft. That's of course the subject of a different video. What we can say is that following its introduction over the skies of Stalingrad, the Yak-9 became a deadly adversary to the Luftwaffe. 14,579 airframes were built during the war, another 2,000 or so post-war. Of these, the Germans claim to have shot down 16%, some 2,289 aircraft. The Yak-9 accounts for about 3.3% of all Allied aircraft claimed by the Germans, and just shy of 5% of those claimed by our top 20 aces. The B-24 Liberator has often been overlooked as historically it stands in the shadow of the famed B-17 Flying Fortress. Consolidated actually aimed to build a bomber to replace the B-17, but instead produced an aircraft that would join it in the fight against the Axis forces. After a visit to the Boeing factory, a result of production initiatives in the late 1930s, Consolidated had put forward a modern bomber design, sporting many features the older B-17 didn't possess, such as a tricycle undercarriage and high-mounted wings. This last feature actually gave the aircraft better fuel efficiency and range. The British, who first operated the type in combat, didn't think much of them and initially relegated the B-24 to the transport role. This was largely because earlier models didn't come with self-sealing fuel tanks. The first B-24 to be claimed by the Luftwaffe was one of the 13 Halverson Project or HAL Pro B-24s, sent to bomb the Romanian oil fields on the 12th of June 1942. Flying from Habania, Iraq, the group had to traverse neutral Turkey to reach Romania. Over the target, they met JG-77, and Lieutenant Heinz Edgar Beres claimed to have downed an American bomber. However, American records suggest that only 4 B-24s were lost on the raid, those that landed in Turkey and were interned. So again, take this with a pinch of salt as we are talking about claims and not entirely verified aerial victories. In that spirit, the Luftwaffe would claim 2,293 B-24 Liberators destroyed, 12% of all those made. But the top German aces barely accounted for 0.5% of this total. The Lavochkin La-5 has gained a reputation as being one of the best Soviet fighters of World War II. Ironically, it was born for one of the worst. Shortcomings in the performance of the earlier Lag series, before the Lavochkin, Gorbunov and Gudkov team was broken up, had shown a need for a better fighter aircraft. This was compounded by the German invasion of 1941. The La-5 solved many of the issues faced by the Lag-1 and Lag-3, starting with the engine. Going down the radial engine route, the La-5FN would eventually get an engine developing 1,850 horsepower. Other design features led to the La-5 being much lighter than previous fighters. This was achieved by substituting heavier delta wood in certain areas of the airframe with conventional wood. Other weight-saving features in early La-5s included using an air starter motor instead of an electric one. Production methods were also improved, which led to nearly 10,000 aircraft being produced from 1942. The first La-5 claimed by the Luftwaffe fell to the guns of Wilhelm Kriesenus of JG-53 on the 3rd of September 1942. In total, the Germans would claim 2,569 La-5s, which is roughly 26% of all those produced. The LA-5 also accounts for nearly 5.5% of all claims made by the top 20 German flyers. The Avro Lancaster is by far the most recognisable British four-engine bomber of World War II. It is associated with some of the most daring missions of the war, including the infamous Dambaster raid in 1943 and the successful attack on the Tirpitz the following year. For the most part, however, the Lancaster joined the rest of RAF Bomber Command and her sister services at the coalface, where it slowly wore down the German war machine, one city at a time. The Lancaster was produced in larger quantities than its other four-engine counterparts, the Short Stirling and the Handley Page Halifax. In total, 7,377 Lancasters rolled off the production lines. 2,682 were to be claimed by the Luftwaffe during World War II, which is a whopping 26%. Lancasters made up nearly 4% of all the aircraft the Luftwaffe claimed to have shot down, but ironically accounts for just 0.02% of the claims made by the top 20 aces. Clearly, it was harder to amass a huge tally flying at night. The first clear claim for a Lancaster shot down was made by Willie Strapman of JG2 on the 16th of April 1942. A further 42 would be claimed by night fighters that year alone. Reportedly, the Lancaster fought back by flying 156,000 operations and dropping 608,212 tons of bombs during World War II. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress will forever be associated with the mighty 8th Air Force and its crusade against Nazi Germany in World War II. Although not the most produced American bomber of World War II, more than twice as many B-24 Liberators were made, nearly twice as many B-17s were shot down. This isn't surprising when you consider that 27 of the 42 bomber groups in the 8th Air Force by 1944 operated the type. It is said that in total the B-17 flew 290,000 sorties and dropped 640,000 tons of bombs during the entire war. Initially, many B-17 crews would not make it through the 25-mission tour they needed to complete to make it home. A large proportion of the 26,000 men killed while serving with the 8th Air Force lost their life in a flying fortress. However, the first B-17 claimed by the Luftwaffe was not flown by an American crew. On the 28th of June 1941, Lieutenant Siegfried Mikosek of JG-52 claimed a B-17. As Germany didn't declare war on the United States until the 11th of December 1941, it must have been an RAF-operated flying fortress. A total of 4,447 B-17s were claimed by the Luftwaffe, which is an astounding 35% of the total 12,731 built. Fortresses accounted for 6.5% of all German claims during the war, but again only 1.2% of those claimed by the top 20 German pilots. Hunting was much better further east, it would seem. As previously mentioned, the Lag-3 has been given the reputation of one of the worst Soviet fighters ever. I actually go into a lot more detail about why that is in another video, which you can check out if you want by clicking on the link above. Let's just say that when the Lag-3 encountered the Luftwaffe in 1941, it was at a distinct disadvantage, but was one of the best answers the VVS had to the threat. The design was soon improved upon with the evolution into the LA-5, as well as with other better Soviet fighters that came to replace it. However, in the meantime, Soviet pilots had to operate an aircraft that was not easy to fly, and had wings that would shatter when hit with German shells. Also, due to the classic early Soviet fighter design, the visibility from the cockpit was poor. Many Russian pilots didn't even see the enemy coming. As an aircraft, it has to be the most decimated type, at least under the guns of the Germans. After checking the numbers a few times to be sure, I can confirm that at least 75% of Lag-3s produced were claimed destroyed by the Germans. That's a whopping 4,928 aircraft of 6,528 built. In terms of total victories claimed by the Germans, the Lag-3 represents 7% of all aircraft shot down, but nearly 14% of those shot down by the 20 top most successful Luftwaffe aces. Clearly, you didn't want to be in a Lag-3 flying over the Soviet Union, nor one on the ground. In many ways, it's unsurprising that the Vickers Supermarine Spitfire is one of the top victims of the Luftwaffe. Although some aircraft on this list are clearly there because they were inadequate and easy meat for Luftwaffe pilots, that's not the case with others. The Spitfire was clearly in the thick of it from the first weeks of the war, right up to the final days. For the most part, those Spitfires were flown by Western allies, and more often than not by RAF pilots. Only some 200 Spitfire 5s made it to the Soviet Union, and 50 of those were intended to be cannibalised for spares. So, with my little patriotic rant over, let's get down to the facts. During World War II, around 22,417 Spitfires of all marks were produced. The Luftwaffe claimed to have shot down around 23% of them. That's 5,265 Spitfires in total. In the grand scheme of things, the British fighter accounts for nearly 8% of all aircraft down by the Luftwaffe, but just 2.3% of those victories claimed by the top 20 German aces. The very first Spitfire shot down by the Luftwaffe was claimed by a pilot of LG-1 on the 23rd of November 1939. However, I'm not entirely convinced by this claim. Several Spitfires were claimed over parts of Germany in 1939 and 1940 where they cannot have been flying. So again, we need to take these claims with a big pinch of salt. The most likely first Spitfire to be shot down by Germany was over Dunkirk, but Lieutenant Hans Krug of JG-26 may also hold that honour. He claimed one over Rotterdam on the 13th of May 1940. During this time, Spitfires were escorting RAF bombers over the Netherlands, flying from English bases. The Spitfire itself would account for 5,950 aerial victories against all enemies, the vast majority being German-flown aircraft. The dubious honour of the most shot down aircraft by the Luftwaffe goes to the IL-2 Stormovik. It was produced in astounding numbers, 36,000, which makes it the second most produced aircraft on this list, just after the 37,000 Yak-1s built. When you combine the IL-2 with its very similar successor, the IL-10, a total of some 42,330 are reported to have been built. This would make it the most produced military aircraft in history. The Luftwaffe claimed to have shot down 7,607 between 1941 and 1945, which is still 21% of the 36,000 IL-2s produced. The Stormovik accounts for over 11% of all Luftwaffe claims and 9.5% of the top 20 German pilots. The first to be claimed fell under the guns of Leopold Münster from JG-3 on the 8th of August 1941. The IL-2 Stormovik, which was designed as a ground attack aircraft, was heavily armoured and was certainly a challenge to shoot down, both from the ground and air. Earlier variants were only crewed by a pilot, with later types including a rear-facing gunner, as a form of defence. IL-2s were also pushed into the fighter role, especially during the Battle of Stalingrad. Their heavy armour made them ideal adversaries for light German bombers, however they must still have been vulnerable to German fighters. As you've made it this far, please like the video to help it spread to more people. If you like the videos I make and want to support me, you can find more details at calibanrising.com/support. The best thing you can do right now is to leave me a comment with your favourite aircraft from this list, and then to watch the video I made just for you on screen now. It's a good one.